SAF has just become, I think, the preeminent gun rights organization, even though it's still a little quiet and the media doesn't know about it as much. It's the organization that's really doing the work.
The Second Amendment Foundation is first and foremost a civil rights organization fighting for civil rights. Just as important as any of these other civil rights organizations, this one just happens to be focused on Second Amendment issues, but it's important to note that it encompasses a lot of other rights, not just the Second Amendment. All these civil rights are interrelated in some way, so that's how I think of SAF primarily as a civil rights organization. It just happens to be focused on Second Amendment issues.
A lot of people really don't know or have never really heard of the foundation, even though it's been involved in some of the biggest court cases in the country. McDonald v. City of Chicago was a Second Amendment Foundation case, and that was a landmark ruling that really opened up the entire country for challenging local and state gun laws that are unconstitutional, because as part of the McDonald decision, the Second Amendment was incorporated to the states via the 14th Amendment. And now, even if a state does not have a state provision in its own state constitution on the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment applies there.
The organization was founded by Alan Gottlieb in the mid-1970s. His vision was to create a body of legal scholarship that would recognize the Second Amendment as, in fact, an individual right, as opposed to the common perception of being something to facilitate a National Guard. Over the years, that also evolved into court challenges of laws that the organization perceived to be draconian, unconstitutional, and unfair to law-abiding, gun-owning American citizens.
Back in 1974, there was very few organizations on the playing field defending gun rights. There really were nobody who was active on a local level, and the only group that really existed was the NRA, and there was no foundation, so to speak, a tax-exempt, publicly supported foundation. And there was a need for that, I thought, in itself as an entity. And then what needed to be done really was an awful lot of public education work and breaking legal ground so that eventually a case could get to the United States Supreme Court.
Alan Gottlieb had the vision to know that we're going to get Second Amendment cases to the Supreme Court. And when we get there, we're going to need some citations. So he started setting that up. So one of the main things I think the Second Amendment Foundation has done has changed the legal landscape in such a way that it makes it possible that now we're getting positive, good decisions from the courts.
Well, let's go back to Alan Gottlieb's original vision going on 50 years ago. He wanted to see legal research done that appeared in peer-reviewed scholarly journals that grabbed the attention of every judge and every practicing attorney. And he succeeded in that. In that original meeting where I first met them, that I mentioned in Boston, was Professor Don Cates.
The scholarship on the Second Amendment is fairly new. About 100 years ago, the First Amendment was in the same place, and it had to develop through a lot of decisions, a lot of court cases. Well, 30 years ago, there was very little work had been done on the Second Amendment. And so what we needed and what we got were law review articles, scholars who decided to study the Second Amendment.
I think SAF clearly focused more than anyone else on the legal scholarship that laid the foundation that eventually brought us to the Heller decision, the McDonald decision, and most recently the Bruin decision in the Supreme Court of the United States. The approach to education has been different, but has been effective.
One of the interesting things that came out of that is we had, at the time, somebody from the University of Florida, is the dean of the law school, who specialized in 14th Amendment arguments, who very much laid out for us that you guys got a problem because the laws you want to challenge are really state laws, and the Second Amendment was never incorporated through the 14th Amendment, making it applicable to the states. And so all these good laws that you could bring challenges to, you can't bring in federal court. It's just not going to work. You can only, the Second Amendment being not incorporated through the 14th Amendment, only applied to the federal government. And the federal government at that point didn't really have any really good bans or really serious things that you could really challenge and sink your teeth into. But Washington, D.C., which is a federal enclave and not a state, had a ban on handguns in your own home and a ban on functional firearms, rifles or shotguns, had to be broken down, so they were not usable. And so that led everybody to realize you got to go to Washington, D.C. to file a suit. And that's sort of some of what led to the Heller case to start with.
I've compared it to the academic side is the artillery and the litigation is the infantry. You don't want to send your infantry in without artillery cover. And so the academic side was developing this, starting, as I say, in the mid-1970s. There were a handful of us who were developing it. Then come 1983, I think, Don Cates got an article in Michigan Law Review, one of the big name law reviews. That brought the Second Amendment issue as an individual right to the attention of the big names in constitutional law. They wouldn't be reading the small journals that we were publishing in, but they would read Michigan. And then you saw the big names in constitutional law, Sanford Levinson, William Van Alstyne, Akhil Amar. They started to read that stuff stemming from Don Cates' article and became converts. So by 1990 or 95, you have all the big names in constitutional law saying, yes, the Second Amendment is an individual right. We ought to be debating its dimensions rather than its existence. So that totally turned around the academic end, which in turn laid the groundwork for the litigation end.
Alan Gura, who's the attorney that argued the Heller case, was doing a lot of work for the Second Amendment Foundation, and we set up another case known as McDonald versus Chicago. Chicago also had a handgun ban, and the day that the decision came down in Heller from the Supreme Court that we won, and that there is an individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, the same day, within hours, we filed against the city of Chicago. And that case, that suit at that point was one. Now that we established an individual right, we then went for the 14th Amendment incorporation. And in order to win against Chicago, you had to have this, courts rule that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, who incorporated the Second Amendment through the 14th Amendment, which was a monumental victory, because that's what opened up all the floodgates for all the litigation that's gone on ever since. In fact, the more recent Bruin case at the U.S. Supreme Court that knocked out New York's very horrible law on being able to get permits to carry firearms for self-protection couldn't have been brought if it weren't for staff's suit in McDonald versus Chicago. And of course, like right now, the Second Amendment Foundation has, I think it's 54 current, at this point, suits at one time going on. Those couldn't have been brought if it weren't for the fact that we won the McDonald case. Every other gun group in the country couldn't be bringing their suits either if it weren't for McDonald versus Chicago. So it really was the Second Amendment Foundation that opened up the floodgates to all this pro-gun rights litigation.
One of the things I really like about the Second Amendment Foundation is its focus. It figures out what it needs to do. It works on that. It moves in that direction. It's not trying to be a lightning rod. It's not trying to get major coverage by saying outrageous things, by appearing to be the crazies out there. They just understand, okay, we need to move here. These are the court cases we need to win. We're going to be the reasonable, responsible adults in the room, but we're going to get the work done. And that way, they actually reflect most gun owners in America. They're the reasonable, rational, safe people that you don't hear much about. They're the ones that really do reflect gun ownership in America, and not the way the media would like to portray it as being guns equal crime.
SAF itself has done a lot of stuff to educate the public. we stick up for the Second Amendment, and when we do that, we remind people that the Second Amendment protects a right, not a privilege. And I think our job has always been to keep that in perspective. And we've been doing that pretty good, especially through our court actions.
The public needs an organization like the Second Amendment Foundation for a number of reasons, but mainly because the amount of time, the amount of money, and the expertise required to have to make these arguments and to achieve victory is fairly specialized. If you look at the lawyers we work with, it's a fairly small group of lawyers that are, experts in their field. If it weren't for organizations like the Second Amendment Foundation, or you put that in any other context for any other kind of advocacy or legal interest, it wouldn't happen in the way it does today. It would be a hodgepodge of lawsuits flying that are done by people not qualified to bring them. Strategic litigation is how we want to shape the world. And then there's opportunistic litigation. There's a plaintiff or somebody who comes to you with a problem and they say, hey, this thing's affecting me. And we look at it and say, okay, there is a public benefit to bringing an action on behalf of this individual.
We accomplished two things with that. One, we established the individual right to begin with, and two, we knocked out a law that was on the books that was anti-gun rights. That was extremely significant. That built the platform that you could then say that we have this right, so who else in the states and the localities are infringing on that right? Chicago, the McDonald versus Chicago case was very important because that's the one that incorporated the 14th Amendment, so the Second Amendment was all now applicable to cities and states. Not only knocked out the Chicago handgun ban, but it gave you then the legal right to take any other state and local law that infringe on your gun rights to federal court. That was extremely, extremely important. The Bruin decision, say that's two legs on the three-legged stool, so to speak. The third leg was Bruin, and the Bruin decision knocked out a New York state law that made it next to impossible to get a permit to carry a firearm because it was a May issue that you had to show need. And if you couldn't show a special need that your life is threatened today, they wouldn't give you a permit to have the gun. And of course, most people can't do that, and that really is a direct infringement on your right of self-defense, a means of self-defense of having the gun to begin with. And so when the court knocked that out, that pretty much established a limitation of how far courts could go. The other part of the Bruin that was extremely important is they changed the level of scrutiny that you needed to pass to be able to win a case in court. Up to that time, there was a rational basis test, an intermediate scrutiny test, a high scrutiny level test, strict scrutiny. And for us, it had to show strict scrutiny, and the burden of proof was on you as the plaintiff, not on the government to defend the law. So the government could come in and argue, well, okay, there's a right to keep and bear arms. You have this right, but it's in conflict with public safety. And so, we're passing these laws to protect the people because some people misuse guns. And as a result, we have this need to do it. And the courts would basically say, okay, there's an individual right, but the government has this compelling interest to protect the public so they can do whatever they want to do. And it shot holes right through the whole Second Amendment. Bruin changed it all, and it's now those levels of scrutiny don't matter. They don't count. It doesn't matter that the government, quote unquote, wants to save a life, so to speak, or a gun could be misused. Now it's about what was the text, what does the text say, and what is the history of the Second Amendment? Why is it there? What rights does it protect? And now there's government laws. The burden's on the government to show that these laws don't infringe on the text and the history, and that's why now it's shifted in our favor.
Today, it's only the most naive who will tell you Second Amendment is about the National Guard. Instead, they'll argue some other thing. They'll argue means end. They'll say, oh, well, we should, you're right, the Second Amendment says you can have guns, so we should have a constitutional convention and strike the Second Amendment.
I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to the debate on guns, if you will, is that a lot of the people who are pro-gun and pro, Second Amendment, they rely on facts and data, and the facts and data support their position. And when they're talking to somebody who doesn't share the same viewpoint and is actually the polar opposite, not a fence sitter necessarily, they're talking in terms of emotion. And those aren't compatible languages. It doesn't matter how much data and statistics and facts you have on your side. If you're talking to somebody who feels a certain way, unless they're willing to look at that from an objective and logical standpoint, they're just not gonna, you're not gonna make that connection with them. And unfortunately, until they're willing to take that leap, there's kind of very little you can do other than show them positive experiences and try to walk them down that road.
The Second Amendment's a doomsday device. Okay, nobody wants there to be another civil war in this country. The first one was horrific enough, okay? But the fact that the common people, everyday people, have the means to repel invaders from their home and to hopefully stop tyranny in this country is what ensures everybody else's rights. And that deterrent effect, the politicians being afraid to say, well, yeah, let's just go ahead and implement tyranny here. Let's start setting up camps and shipping people to camps who have wrong ideas. Let's start canceling people's jobs and benefits because they're on the wrong side of the political spectrum. We don't want to see that happen. And we certainly don't want to see violence in the streets. But what we do want to do is we want to live in a world where there's a balance of power, where the government is afraid of us, the people, but the people also have a government that is responsive to what they want done. And that's the balance. And by the way, it's never solved. And that's the one thing that I think that some people naively assume that, oh, well, if we just have the penultimate Supreme Court case, or we finally elect this politician or that politician, or we finally put magic words on a piece of paper, that we're all going to live in peace for the rest of our lives. No, it's a constant process. We always have to constantly be reevaluating what is our relationship with our fellow man? What is our relationship with the state? What is our relationship with the rest of the world? And make sure that we achieve this balance of power that ensures the maximum liberty for the individual, but allows us to have effective government to do those things that only government can do.
I think people are really adamant in pertaining to Second Amendment rights because it means a lot to them, not just for their rights of self-defense and self-protection, but it's about freedom. And if you can take that freedom away from you, what other freedoms can you take away? And going back, this is really, it's for me, what I've discovered is this isn't a piece of paper that we're defending and for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's a really human rights issue that affects people. It's part of our Bill of Rights of individual freedom. And I don't think you could, quote unquote, take one piece of it out without all the other rights unraveling. Because if you can take one out and destroy one right in the Bill of Rights, it opens up a door to destroy other parts of the Bill of Rights. And you may not care about the Second Amendment, you might not care about gun ownership at all, but there's something in the stream of freedom that our Constitution protects, the Bill of Rights protects, that that you care about. And if you let part of it be destroyed, the part that interests you the most or concerns you the most, it's going to be attacked next. And the Second Amendment Foundation is obviously one of the premier groups that supports that right all across the board, no matter if you're wealthy, if you're poor, if you're black, if you're white, if you're a man, or you're a woman, if you're gay or straight. We basically work with everybody across the board protecting that right so that everybody has the right to the means of defending themselves, their family, and their loved ones.
SAF is Otis McDonald. SAF is Rhonda Ezel. It was about a person. A lot of people, but it was about a person. Someone with a story. The right to keep and bear arms is one thing, but it all comes out of the fact that you have a natural right, which goes back over 1,000 years. You have a natural right to defense of self and defense of family. So when I go to the United Nations or I'm speaking somewhere else in Europe, they don't give a hoot about our Second Amendment, okay? And I don't expect them to. But I'm talking about somebody's natural right. And even in the United Nations Charter, they recognize the right to defense of self and defense of family.
I think the future is very bright. As far as the Second Amendment's concerned, right now is a very good time to be in the courts. Right now, particularly post-Bruin, a lot of judges, even judges that are Democratic appointed, are ruling in favor of the Second Amendment. It's really a time where the work for the last 50 years is finally starting to show the most fruition it has. As far as the Second Amendment Foundation, we're bringing on as much talent as possible to ensure that we're able to keep that trajectory for the Second Amendment moving forward in that manner.
What SAF has done is it's built a foundation, a really good, solid foundation. But there's so much more that SAF needs to do.
So I think it's really important for every individual that supports the Second Amendment, wants to keep and bear arms, that everyone who has any interest in that understands that this fight can't be won without money and without support. Those who would take our guns have such an unbelievable amount of money behind them from so many different sources that we know about very well and sources that we don't know about. And they're so well funded. And so, fortunately, we have our Constitution on our side, we have truth on our side, and that's why we've been successful, because we have far less resources and less money than our adversaries do in terms of protecting the Second Amendment. And so, for any one person who thinks it's enough and I don't have to do anything, I think they should really take a step back and think about that. When you look at the kind of money that is pouring in against our right to keep and bear arms, I think every individual, every company, everyone out there should take a second look at how they can support an organization like the Second Amendment Foundation as one of the leaders in this cause.
The Second Amendment Foundation is now an institution, and it needs to carry on way past Allen. And I'm really proud of our staff and supporters and our members that have done what they've done so far, but I need to turn the reins over to other people. This organization is going to continue to grow and grow faster.